So look, thank you all so much for coming today to our Theatre Network New South Wales meeting. I'd just like to start by acknowledging that we're gathering today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. I thought I'd just start with a really quick summary of the history of the Theatre Network, just for those of you who are maybe joining us for the first time. This began with an idea, I guess, between a conversation between Nathan Bennett and David Williams, and it quickly expanded into a bigger conversation with many of us in the sector who thought it might be a good idea or an interesting idea to start exploring whether some sort of network for theatre in New South Wales would be an interesting and a useful thing. We received a small grant from Arts New South Wales and commissioned Kim Hanna to undertake a scoping study, and he consulted really widely with people across the sector and examined a number of different models that such a network might, different forms that such a network might take. And he concluded very broadly that there was a lot of support to have some sort of theatre network which could undertake various roles, including advocacy, sharing of resources, and just events like this, networking events, opportunities for us to all be together and to meet. Since then, though, there hasn't been any further funding available to us, and so really the theatre network just remains as a very loose germ of an idea still, with a small steering committee whose ability to engage with the forum kind of fluctuates depending on how busy we are doing other things. And so the reins are absolutely there for the taking. If anyone else would like to, be part of seeing this become something bigger, and anyone has an idea for what we might do next, then it's totally all yours. It's really up for grabs at the moment. So, look, with the National Theatre Forum, which took place in Canberra a couple of weeks ago, this seemed like a really great opportunity to come together and to talk, and a chance for those who weren't at the forum to hear a little bit about what took place there, and for those of us who were there to regroup, I guess, and to continue the conversations. And we're in no way attempting to recap the entire 3 days, and nor is this intended to be any sort of hard-hitting critique of the forum. It's just an opportunity to hear some really personal perspectives from our fabulous, brave, intrepid panelists, and then for us all to have an opportunity to share thoughts and ideas and ask questions. Another opportunity to talk, and of course to have a drink downstairs, as all good theatre gatherings must have. So I'd like to introduce Sarah Rodigari, who is bravely facilitating today's panel, and I'll just quickly read Sarah's biog. Sarah is a Sydney-based artist working across mediums to create performances and installations. Her work focuses on history, sociology, socio-political engagement, chance encounters, failure, and the absurd. And the structures of her work are widely varied, including lecture, duration, dialogue, narrative, podcasts, speeches, and improvisation. She's presented work nationally and internationally and contributes writing to Real Time, Runway Magazine, and Live Art List Australia. Sarah is part of the duo Panther and the art collective Field Theory. She's currently writing a chapter on performance art and transformation for the Royal Geographic Society and is completing her PhD in creative arts at the University of Wollongong. So please join me in welcoming Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So I would also like to introduce my fellow panel members today. So to my left is Clare Britton from my darling Patricia, and I'm just going to make up Clare's bio. So Clare has been a founding member of my darling Patricia, and also in addition to that is a performance maker in her own right, and a theatre designer, and I had something else I couldn't remember, but
no, that's good.
That's okay. All right. And then, moving right along, we've got Sopa Enari, is a Samoan writer and actor, originally from Wellington. He studied acting at the New Zealand National Drama School and has worked for radio, theatre and film as both an actor and writer. And he is subsequently invited by Griffin Theatre Company this year as an artist to undertake the Cultural Leadership Program alongside Indigenous playwrights, whose name I don't actually have on my sheet.
It's Nakia Louis.
Nakia Louis, right.
And an Asian-Australian performance maker, Genevieve Cheng.
Okay, great, thank you. And then we have Julieanne Campbell, who is also an arts manager who has worked in Australia and the UK, the US and Asia. Started as a journalist in Indonesia in the early 90s and soon specialised in communications and business strategy in the arts, working on 3 Venice Biennales, the inaugural Media City Seoul, and was general manager of performance breaks from 2003 to 2012. She was the business manager for the 2012 Paramasala Festival that celebrates the global impact of South Asian arts and cultures before joining UTP in 2013. Julieanne has been on the range of boards, including chair of PACT, Centre for Emerging Artists, and is currently on the management committee of Inner West Cultural Services and my darling Patricia. A little bit of a connection here, I see. And finally,
Me.
we've got Sonny Dallas-Law is a Waka Waka man from Southeast Queensland region, and he has worked in the performing arts industry as a writer, co-deviser and performer for many years. He was previously the Cultural Development Officer for the City of Sydney, Redfern Community Centre, where he created and implemented community events and initiatives. And Sonny is currently the Aboriginal Associate for Black Lions at Performing Lions. So the idea for today is to keep it relatively informal, and that I've asked each of the panel members to address a particular area of the Australian Theatre Forum that was of interest to them, or not. It could be something that they didn't like at all, that they'd like to talk about. And we'll ask a few questions of each other, and then we'll also invite you to come in at the end and ask questions of us and again of each other. I've noticed that there's quite a few of you here today who are also at the Theatre Forum, so it'd be great to also hear your perspective. So to start with, I thought that I would do a summary of the forum from my perspective, which is loosely tied into 2 of the blogs that I kind of thought were incredible throughout the forum, and kind of would like to recognise the support of Jane Howard and Augusta Supple in what they wrote, and their blogging was incredible. So I've kind of used their perspectives in my writing. So this year's forum took place in Canberra amongst the festivity of the centenary of Canberra, as well as the Australia Council Marketing Summit and the APACA Australian Performing Arts Centres Association Conference Fear No Art, and the Tipping Point Gathering, The Future Unimaginable or Unthinkable. Resonating with these visionary and provocative titles of those events, the Australian Theatre Forum itself was titled To the Heart of It. And in her curatorial statement, Alicia Talbot proposed that we look forward over the next 30 years and think about the broader questions that we grapple with as makers, artists, and cultural producers. She wanted to talk about what's not possible. And in hindsight, for me, this is exactly what happened. For me, the forum contained 3 keywords that people kept coming back to as provocations, which were hope, future, and risk. At the keynote presentation on day 1 was a discussion held between futurist Kristen Alford and anthropologist Lenore Manderson, in which they asked, do we even have a future? Which, of course, for me propels the question, does theatre have a future? In David Milroy's session titled The Burning Question, he talked about the power of theatre and invited us to think about the fire in our bellies and what drives us in the work that we make. At the Tipping Point session, which ran concurrently on day 1, Senator Christine Milne asked us what song we would write to drive us forward into action. Incidentally, the song in her day was Here Comes the Sun, but that can no longer be used through copyright issues, so she proposed that we reconsidered our own song. And then day 2 brought us more questions from the New York-based Nature Theatre group of Oklahoma and their project OK Radio, which is a weekly podcast of conversations with theatre practitioners from around the world. They asked the questions like, why art, why this art, and why now? And they also pushed buttons in a way that perhaps only outsiders can, in a way that brought us as a collective of theatre makers, of people interested in the future of Australian theatre, together and to stand up and address what mattered to us. And from this session and other sessions, the fire in the belly that arose I guess from many of these conversations, resulted in an impromptu closed afternoon session between the Australia Council and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island theatre makers, in which it was decided upon that a best practice document would be produced by this community of artists, and we, the larger community of artists, would support it, and we agreed to. Other forums included debunking some myths around the major theatres. Two key questions asked by the audience were about providing spaces for Australian playwrights and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists. In contrast to the strength and power of Australia's major theatre companies, Augusta Supple blogged, "It's my firm and sturdy belief that the riskier and most interesting and vibrant work happens in the independent sector. And that sector is fueled by inspiration, which isn't and can't be subscribed, dictated, or money-orientated. The independent sector has to generate work that is compelling and inspiring enough for people to want to invest their time. And so therefore, for me, I look at the strength of the independent sector as a litmus test of our art scene." And finally, on the last day, we were invited to make our mark with a keynote from Naji Chu, also known as Miss Chu, Queen of the Rice Paper Rolls. So Naji spoke about impossibilities, breaking the rules, taking risks, and gave the following advice. She said, "The personal is everything. The personal is political. The political is also professional. Be your own boss. Don't pander to ego. Invest in what you believe in. And there's no success," and she stressed this, "there's no success without social media." So returning to social media for my last comment and back to the blog of Augusta Supple, I'd like to quote one of her observations, which is that despite the rhetoric of being curious and open and experimental and risky and brave and generous in our art making, sometimes theatre makers forget to be that with each other. So in that quote, I would like to open that proposal up to us on the panel and to all of you in terms of, I don't know, just say what's on your mind, put it out there, and let's see where we go. And so with this in mind, I thought I might start, well, with you, Claire. Because maybe you were closer to me, or is there anyone who has like a burning response to what I've said that they want to fire off with? By all means, do. But is that a yes from you, Sonny, or just?
I'm just nodding my head.
Okay, that's fine then. So I will then just go back and start with Claire, and perhaps we were talking loosely about a session that you went to that you enjoyed or didn't. That
yeah. There were two sessions I think that that stood out for me for different reasons. Like the session with OK Radio was it was a really interesting session, and there was a lot of there are a few instances over the forum where Aboriginal issues came to the fore, and some of those occasions you did get to see the space kind of change into being a forum. So where the head of the Australia Council can be speaking, and an independent artist from Victoria can get up and say that having to provide a certificate of Aboriginality as Aboriginal artists in Australia have to, and it's a measure that's in place to make sure the money gets to the right people, but it's an occasion where someone can say that this practice is problematic and it's difficult, and they can say it to the right person. So I appreciated seeing that and watching that conversation develop and grow over the whole course of the forum, and I felt sometimes like the conversation wasn't as sophisticated as I'd like it to be able to be, you know, there were some really basic questions coming up within that forum that I felt like I wish we'd be able to just move past that and get to the more interesting questions. And I guess that there's a question that comes up that's like, well, how do you get to those interesting questions and move the stuff that's about people introducing themselves or talking to areas that don't seem as urgent or as interesting, like how. So I don't really know the answer to that, but.
What would perhaps be like an interesting or a matter of urgency, perhaps for you, and almost also in relation to your practice, and maybe in that you would like to kind of perhaps focus on more so than?
Well, I think that with my practice, I work in the independent sector, and I think most people who do are always making work because there's an urgency about what they want to say, because we're in that arena that I think most of us are a part of. That's the reason that you're working within that realm. It's the main motivating factor. And so, did I answer that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I guess in that sense of urgency, or the fact that if you work independently, there's a sense that you define your own work.
Yeah.
You can tell your own stories, so to speak, or
Yeah.
you make your stories up, or if you make a narrative story, just placing that in a bucket there.
Look, following on from Claire, what really surprised me at the forum was the, you know, there was so much talk about, you know, black theatre and how important it is to, you know, the theatre, you know, industry in Australia. And it really, like, I was just absolutely spun out, really. Like, Alicia was sort of like standing there next to me, and, you know, all these funny questions were coming up. I know some of you were there, and I'm just looking at Alicia and I'm just like, oh God, it's, you know. But it was, at the same time, I was really, really surprised and excited that, you know, all these, there's a lot of presenters there. I work for Black Lions. We have 21 consortium members. I think a couple of yous are here at the moment. You know, they really want to, you know, tour great, amazing Aboriginal work. But at the same time, like, it's sort of like I'm not quite sure where I'm going now, but it really sort of just spun me out how many people were, you know, non-Indigenous people were really excited about what's happening now. And one reason why we had to have the closed-off session, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because that was just our closed-off session. But we realised in the first 2 days of the theatre forum that, you know, a lot of people wanted to talk about it, and they realised that, you know, black theatre is, you know, it is what, you know, Australia theatre it is too, basically, you know. One really major word that came up throughout APACA and the Australia Theatre Forum was collaboration. And what is collaboration, basically? And I still don't quite get that myself, what it is, because at the same time in our closed-up conversation, we're trying to figure out what is Aboriginal theatre. I run Black Lions. The whole purpose of putting Black Lions together was to select, you know, professional plays that run around the country two plays that run around the country, and they have to be specifically Aboriginal plays. The guidelines for Black Lions is not exactly an Aboriginal play. It can be a white writer, but a black director and black actors. And one of the conversations that's been happening at the national, I don't like saying Indigenous, because Indigenous, if you look in the dictionaries, is ethnic minority. I always please say Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. At the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander forums that we have had, the question comes up every single year, what is an Aboriginal play? And I get this all the fucking time from people everywhere. It's like, so what's the difference between black theatre and white theatre? And for me, and I think a lot of my Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peers agree that a black play is written by an Aboriginal person, directed by an Aboriginal person, and at least has Aboriginal actors, but also, and when you're doing an Aboriginal play, it gets way more complex, which I can't even explain. It's the consultation that comes with that too, as well. And what really, I might be going off a bit sort of the subject that you're talking about, but there's also, when you're writing, I went to a couple of sessions, I went to a dance session. I'm not really into dance, but I thought I'd go there because I don't know nothing about dance, and then I heard some of the facilitators saying, we just create this from nothing, which is, like, to me, insulting, because Aboriginal people have been doing theatre, dance and visual arts for over 60,000 years now, and that's very much proven. And what we do, it never comes from nothing. There's always some sort of context that our work comes from. So it really surprised me at some of the sessions I came from, where people just say, it just comes from nothing, we just get a group of people together, and I don't understand that sort of concept of creating theatre, because I'm not only a producer, I've been doing lots of theatre making for quite a long time, and it always comes from something. So I don't know, I probably just sort of went from this to that, but
Well, yeah. I think, this conversation between, say, for me, thinking about this idea of theatre and, say, theatre making or performance making and structures of making work, I felt was, kind of sat in the shadows throughout the forum, and would like to have perhaps heard a little bit more about it. But then again, I wasn't really at the session with David Pledger, Sopa, that you were at, that was about, in which he spoke about, and anyone correct me if I'm wrong, but he did talk about this idea of different levels of creativity across, say, arts administrators, directors, actors, I don't know, performance makers, however you want to term it. But this idea of, as opposed to there being this idea of hierarchy, that it exists in a more kind of horizontal kind of playing field, and it would have been interesting, and all. I'm trying to also to avoid saying what I would have liked to have happened at the Australian Theatre Forum, and I now know that I just have. I've kind of thought a little bit more about this idea of maybe collective practice, collaborative practice, or diverse notions of theatre making. So maybe, Sopa, you could talk a little bit about what you experienced with David and his paper.
His paper is Valuing the Artist in the New World Order.
There you go. And that forum was The Artist is Dead, Long Live the Artist?
Long Live the Artist.
That's right.
Yes, but I think it's also quite fitting what you said. the idea of trying not to talk about the Australian Theatre Forum in terms of what you would have loved to have seen at the Australian Theatre Forum. Because I kind of, in hindsight, I tend to think that that's actually the success of the Australian Theatre Forum, is to generate these questions that you can walk away from and then spend the next 2 years asking each other about. In David's and Martin Portis's session, they really spoke about, or rather the things that really stood out to me was when David spoke about the powerlessness or the powerless world that the Australian artist lives in currently. And when he talks about the hierarchy of the current model being vertical rather than horizontal, he then also further dives into the idea of it being a horizontal model, but that it's also circular.
Right.
And that there's a core element that makes art, which is the artist. And he was speaking about how the current model is kind of back to front. That at the moment what you have central to any organisation is a bureaucrat, and that the actual artist is really the outer ring, right outside all of them. And he used a lot of examples like talking about the living wage of an artist and making comparatives to the living wage of an artistic director. And then speaking about and exploring about the idea of which one actually, if you remove one, that the whole organisation falls apart. He spoke about how the artist needs to realise himself in that sense, that without the plays that the playwrights would write, or the vision that directors would have, or the talent that an actor can commit on stage, without any of that, there's nothing for an administrator to administer. But in saying all of that, the reason why David Pledge's why him as a person really fascinated me was because he was starting to bring out a lot of complex questions that I had, that I would rather have spent those 3 days questioning. And it had a lot more to do with, the word Australia and the word theatre. And it made me think about a lot of questions which I wondered about Australian theatre in the last few years that I'd been here, and in particular, like the treatment of artists, the current state of being or the evolution of the artist. You know, like it allowed me to start thinking about questions like, how does an actor see themselves today? Is an actor just an actor? Because they also have to be like a set designer or a set builder. They have to give writing a go, and so this session really got to me because it actually was the thing that I thought I was going to experience. I thought that that's what the whole of Australian Theatre Forum was going to be about, speaking about the current state of Australian theatre. Where are we at this point? He spoke a lot about the necessity for the artist to become self-aware because then we can find our voice as a country in this theatrical form, and that without that awareness, we would struggle to accumulate or to build the basic foundations of what he considers to be Australian theatre.
And so I was thinking about this idea of self-awareness and infrastructure, because I kind of feel like even if you're an independent artist, you need to in some ways divide yourself into multiple sections of being, this morning I'm administering my practice, this afternoon I'm going to write a poem, and this evening I will be networking at the pub. Well, I don't know, however you might divide that, but this idea of another comment on I think Augusta's blog is this: during the forum, for me, I was surprised that there were so many independent artists. I felt like there were quite a lot of peers there for me that I hadn't seen in a while. however, a lot of commentary on the blog with where were the independent artists, where were the younger independent artists, where were the older independent artists on the panel. Again, I'm just saying what wasn't at the forum or was at the forum, in case anyone else wanted to pick up on that. And so this idea of how independent artists and I think larger arts organisations or major theatre companies sit alongside each other is quite interesting. And in some ways, I guess maybe Wesley Enoch put it quite succinctly when he said, if you're not interested in the work that we make, then don't come to our shows, go somewhere else. Or you exist in your own sense of community. And there is that, I felt like there was, I would like to have heard more from this independent sense of community of artist-run initiatives that are supporting, I guess, more of this project of self-realisation and I guess, I'm trying to think, an example of that would be aphids. An example of that would be My Darling Patricia, and which is a group of artists, I guess, running their own show in some ways.
I felt like for us there was something that wasn't, it wasn't a massive feature on the whole, in the whole landscape of what was happening at the Theatre Forum, but that I felt would be just very useful for My Darling Patricia. I found it a really useful idea, and it was something that Robin Archer was talking about on the panel that was about there were major festival directors who were talking, and she was talking a little bit about, she used a bit like a sporting analogy to get at this. Yeah, she was saying, that she loves the Adelaide Crows. She goes to, she'll follow what happens with them every single game. That she watches the change of personnel, and she looks at their training, and they lose a game, and she's really, really cut about it, but she'll follow them again next week, and she'll look at their progress, and she was saying essentially, I think that that maybe that sport's better at communicating about process than artists are, and definitely when we're presenting our work, like on our website or whatever, we'll kind of show the photographs of when it worked out in the end, the best things, and try to kind of, I guess, communicate about it in its best light. But we spend so much more time in the process of making that work, and really so little time performing it, and it's something that is kind of devastating about the way that theatre works or doesn't work in Australia. That moment of performing the work, it's very hard to get the opportunity to repeat a work and to hone it with an audience. And when you're making original work particularly, so the whole thing's been created for that particular season, you're just getting the opportunity to go again and again and again is really important and really rare. And so when Robin was saying that thing about process, I thought, well, we could change that very easily and straight away. It's actually something quite small that we can do. That just changes the conversation a little bit, so that it's not so much about here's the product, here's what we ended up with, but that the emphasis is on what it takes to get there, and so that felt for me like something it's quite tangible that you could actually take away from the conversation, and I like that.
It seems to me like it comes back to a little bit about what you were saying before as well about the value of the arts, and we talk about process as such a major part of that, but the thing that I guess what I found really interesting in Tipping Point, which was the thing what I was going to talk about, but what sort of struck me overwhelmingly was the scientists in the room, and it was such a great opportunity to sort of have artisan scientists in the room, which is the whole conversation around tipping point and it coming into being. I think the guy Graham Pearson, who is with the CSIRO, he was for a long time, Pearman, sorry. So he was he joined the CSIRO in the early 70s and was Chief of Atmospheric Research for 10 years and is now a consultant with Monash University. And he gave an amazing sort of summary of, all the scientific facts and summarised it incredibly well. But it was him and a number of other scientists that I got to sit around the table with, was this almost, not imploring, but I guess it was really brought home by what was said by Christine Milne, which was, seeing the value of the arts as being somehow this mechanism that that the Green movement had failed because what they had pushed was facts and rational thinking, and what the arts did was appealed to an emotion, to us on an emotional level, and that the whole Green movement needed to make a shift, and it needed to start talking to people from an emotional place where people actually started to be affected by what was going on, and therefore that's the instigator for action and change. And I guess for someone, like I looked at his resume and then, the bio and all this information, and I just had this, I was overwhelmed by thinking, wow, you're such an amazing man. You've just done such an amazing thing with your life. And here you are looking to the arts as the point of not the answer, but in some ways, a major part of what's not working with the issue of climate change. And it does come back to what you were saying. I feel, and I was thinking about it on the way here, I thought, are we a little defensive in Australia about the arts, which is maybe your issue of like, do we not treat artists very well? Like, are we a little, is there, I know there's a cultural issue around the arts, but have we sort of absorbed that a little bit and become a little bit defensive, and maybe, someone like, which you referred to, the woman who runs, what's her name? Yeah, just so brazen and bold and empowered. And I know a lot of us are and a lot of people are, but sometimes when you think about, wow, I could just open up my process a little bit more, and that's really valued. That's actually something that people who aren't in the arts see and understand. And one of the sessions that was quite interesting in Tipping Point was around risk, and that we don't practice risk, that risk is something you learn to do by doing it, and that creates and expands our experiences of the world. And I do think it's what the independent sector does very well, is take risk, but maybe we don't see that as an asset and something that we could leverage off better.
I never got invited to the Tipping Point.
I invited
I
myself.
Was going to the Canberra Tip. That's what I thought. I just thought, okay.
No, I didn't get invited. I snuck in.
Yeah, I should have did that.
I just wanted to be there.
Yeah, but I don't want to miss David Milroy's speech too,
No,
which
that
was
was
fantastic.
sad.
So
I know, it was hard. I felt torn a lot of the time.
So perhaps we could open it up for some questions or comments or anything you'd like to say, really. Or there are microphones in the room, just a reminder. Viv and Simon have microphones. And although we can perhaps hear each other, I think it's also for the posterity of recording that microphones
Can I just say to Sarah, Sophie, sorry?
No, sir.
Sarah?
Yeah.
Sarah, yeah. I was really surprised by how many independent artists that were there this year, and it's so good to see. And it really needs to be encouraged more as well too, for artists to come along. And I think funding bodies need to support independent artists to come to these forums too, and and have their say as well too. or even if they don't want to say anything, just listen to what we all carry on about, basically, you know. It's, you know.
I think the breakout sessions, which were like the kind of the looser sessions in the afternoon, which are working sessions they were called, weren't they? Where I think that's when, I guess, people who didn't have the chance to speak as much in the morning kind of forums felt the space of some of the breakout sessions for me were real kind of hands-on manifesto writing processes. One of them was about I think live art, and which I attended. Actually, I didn't really attend that. I know it's been recorded because I was at Tipping Point. I just walked past it for a brief moment. Oh, and then the other one was also in relation to audiences and shifting natures of audiences, which also was a topic I think that came up quite a few times, which is this growing change in audience, not necessarily in age, but also in this desire for audiences to be more of a part of the process of the artwork, not necessarily advocating for kind of a rush on a relational aesthetic kind of practice, but suggesting that perhaps this idea of following your theatre company or your favourite performance artist in the same way that you do your football team might be a great way of kind of generating more of a sense of community or audience or fan base anyway. Sponsorship. Jess.
Hi. I have a question that kind of goes to what you were saying, Julieanne, about this idea of art as a mechanism. And I'm not sure if you were talking about a defensiveness to that in the sense of I'm not sure if art has to always be a mechanism. And I guess I just want to put that out as a question, is how do people feel about this idea of art as having or needing a sense of a cause or a ethical sort of underlying to it, because then how does risk play into that? I think often my question, I guess, is how is risk and this idea of art as a mechanism, how do you marry those two, or are they mutually exclusive?
Yeah, I don't know whether I was talking about mechanism in that way. Maybe I was thinking about process and just the opportunity of leveraging off the things that we do in our art making process that we maybe don't take advantage of, and that's just me being a little bit entrepreneurial and arts managery. But I think that the session with on OK Radio by the Theatre of Oklahoma was really interesting because it kept on drilling into that issue of like, why theatre? Why theatre? If you want to talk about that particular issue, or that's your sort of champion, you know, thing that absolutely is the burning issue that you need to say, why theatre? Why not go into politics, or why not become an activist, or why not sort of, you know, make lots of money so you can change the world, or whatever that might be? And I thought that was a really interesting conversation, and I don't, you know.
It's a form of expression. And the art in itself is a desire to tell a story, to express something, and if it becomes a mechanism. So I think Christine Mill had it completely wrong. It's not why hasn't the arts written a song? It's the artists certainly have written songs about it. It's the fact that burning passion hasn't been picked up by society and hasn't created this momentum behind that. And so it's more about why as an industry and as theatre makers and as artists across the board, aren't we engaging with those topics? But it's not a mechanism. The mechanism is the byproduct. The art is the burning desire to say something. Isn't that what we make work?
And also there's so many different things to say depending on who you are and where you know, and like, and the whole sort of thing of unknown territory, which I guess risk-taking is about, really, you know, that should have very few parameters around it if it's really to be that. which should be, if your whole premise is to, I need to communicate something to someone else, is that problematic as a desired outcome?
I feel like there is this idea that did come up against this idea of theatre, and maybe this is where ideas of theatre and, say, visual arts divide, this idea of as theatre as efficacy, like should theatre be used as a medium to affect change or some kind of push a political agenda, and in response to a lot of what the of OK Radio, I think Nancy Black said no. She kind of stood up and said, I'm political, but my work is something different. And I think...
It's not, theatre does.
Sorry?
And arts does create discourse. That's what we do.
You think
And
that's what it does?
It absolutely does.
But you're saying it's a byproduct.
It's not its raison d'etre, but it absolutely is. It's where we have the discussions. It's where we have the hard discussions. And you do it through art, as well as other places. But the discourse is created through work.
I agree. I think it's also a question of scale. You know that there's a you know that just because something's personal, because the scale of it is small, it doesn't make it necessarily less political or less urgent. It's just someone responding to the culture they see around them and communicating that back, and whether that's like a very small, intimate, small-scale experience and exploration, if that's resonant, it makes you think of everything bigger. So I don't think they have to be. I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think just to clarify, I think that the difference in talking about the fact that, say, art does or theatre does, and of course, it opens up a space for discussion and thinking. There's a difference between framing it as this work is about climate change and how we're going to get you to change your mind or your practice of recycling, say. I think there's...
Guaranteed the worst show you're ever going to see. But that's not it. And it's about actually what someone wants to say and the message, and it resonates and it passes on and it moves on, and someone else writes a response to it and someone else writes another play. Like it's not about a specific mechanism. It's about creating discourse. It's about having hard discussions. It's about creating the space where things that can't be said are said and shown and done. And you know, that's what we do. That's what we're here for.
But in relation to scale that goes, Theatre of Oklahoma no longer make live performances though. And so can we talk about the nature of how they've scaled their live practice into this OK Radio, which I don't know much about.
And it's all conversation.
Right.
And I think that's great. It's like, just someone's journey as an artist. They're like getting rid of the stuff that they don't think they need anymore. And saying, we think the most interesting thing is the conversations we have with people. And so that's all we can do. I like it.
That's theatre itself.
Yeah.
Totally.
It's all theatre.
Totally.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of the art of conversation is the essence of art, so to speak, which is exactly what Ross Gibson did. I think was it in the 2008 Biennale when he just sat in the Art Gallery of New South Wales and had conversations with people. And so, the fact that this we're not making theatre anymore, but we're going to sit on stage and have a discussion, which was the whole thing was we played out a theatre in front of each other, which had highs and lows and was quite a show. I felt.
Which was interesting for me, that we kept on talking so much about the future, but it felt like there was a conversation to be had about what's now. Could we just talk about what's going on now? I mean, I'm not saying, I think it was such an interesting exercise too, and I agree, I don't want to talk about what the Theatre Forum wasn't, because the premise of Tipping Point, which I quite liked, was you have the conversation that you're supposed to have, right? But we were a lot of the forum was these 30 years forward, and I think that was so effective in terms of trying to sort of garner a certain energy around, what we're trying to do and where we're trying to go, and think about that and imagine that, and imagination being a major part of what we're all supposed to be good at. Work right now would have been an interesting
And it was all about the 2030, how the theatre industry will be. And as an Aboriginal person that's in the arts industry, 30 years is just like... Fuck, basically. We're still dealing with non-Indigenous people trying to understand, the stories that we are trying to tell. And me personally, we don't need to go back and tell the whole victim stories anymore now. It's, there's a lot of new great stuff out there at the moment. If you go out and see shows that are in development at the moment from young artists, it's groundbreaking stuff. It's like science fiction, they're talking about blackfellas in spaceships and all that sort of stuff. It's fantastic, but still got a story about our history, and, but done in a way of, by keeping with our protocols. And 2030 is too beyond for us to look at, because at the moment there's still a lot of misunderstanding of, the work that's going on at the moment. Major companies, I don't want to mention them because there might be people here from them, that still want to put on shows that have been done 20 years ago. There is just so much great work out there, and I'm not just talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but there's a lot of other different cultures out there too that aren't being recognised, which I see quite a lot too, from many different worlds that are doing great work, and that needs to, be a major, that was no session at the Australian Theatre Forum as well too,
I thought personally that the concept of looking towards the future was really apt and perfect, to be quite honest, because firstly it stops you from doing what people usually naturally do, which is just focus on the glass half empty that's right now. But secondly, also to get people in a unified sense projecting towards what they would like this industry or the society that they are a part of to be like in the future. You can't necessarily project yourself forward unless you imagine where you're projecting yourself towards. So I thought that was actually really quite good to do that. And what it actually did for me in observation was it allowed me to see the actual issues today that we are struggling with as a theatre industry. Making a lot of comparatives too between my new country and my old country, and seeing a lot of things that other countries have already experienced that I can't even say, there were some issues that I saw and I thought, I can't even say that Australia's grappling with that, because there's just a huge sense of apathy towards issues anyway, So that was really interesting to see that by trying to project ideal images of what the future is, it allowed people to see what they wanted that wasn't actually happening right now. So I thought that was actually pretty good. There was just a lot of things where a lot of conversations were had that was really awesome to have them, but just not really had in the right way. Yeah.
I just want to ask a question, and it's been a question on my mind for a couple of years now, and since I have a room full of peers and others, I'll just go ahead and ask it. It kind of dovetails on the point the gentleman was making here. When do you think Australia is going to enter the 20th century and institute a colorblind casting scheme throughout its theatres? Because this is where the beginning of possible conversations, collaborations begin, when you stop marginalizing cultures into artistic ghettos where their work all has to be about their experiences, even though that's valuable, of course. But when you start looking beyond someone's ethnicity or color in casting or in collaboration or in production, bring people in and then begin a new conversation on what's possible thematically.
Can I just sort of start that answering that by saying that have you read Lee Lewis's paper about colourblind casting, multiculturalism? Well, she speaks about how in Australia at the moment the term colourblind is really contentious. And looking at the idea of not necessarily removing colour from the stage, but actually celebrating it. It's also really hard to put like an Italian man as the father of Juliet, and then a Sudanese girl as the daughter, as Juliet. Just purely because people already have their own connotations.
Right. And you know what? Those connotations will not change. I'm sorry, thanks. Those connotations will not change unless they're confronted and challenged. And you know, this sort of thing has been going on in the States, in the UK,
yes,
and other places for decades.
Yes.
Decades now. And you know, I remember Vanessa Redgrave had a production of Julius Caesar, where Julius Caesar was this big black guy, you know, who was going out with her at the time, but nevertheless. You know, unless you confront people's notions of what is normal to view, those notions will not go away.
But the question then begs, is it about removing the actual connotations that they already have in their head about race, ethnicity, colour, or is it about actually acknowledging that and working with it and trying to create something out of that? If you look at Peter Brook's work, you know, there's a piece of work that he had where there was like 120 different languages on stage. Right. But within 5 minutes of watching it, you immediately switch off the need to understand the language, and you start to read the action. You know, and that's not removing colour, that's actually adding it all in there.
By presenting it to an audience, I didn't speak with them, I thought I could. But by presenting it to an audience, though, they do switch off. And by seeing a broader range of people in roles that are not necessarily specific to any ethnicity when it's not called for, also can broaden someone's imagination as to what's possible, you know, to see on stage, what's acceptable or possible.
I'm starting to see the change. You know, there are theatre companies like Urban Theatre Projects, there's Carriage Works, there's Pack Theatre. There are, you know, there's a lot of companies that are, you know, doing their best basically to sort of, I guess to answer your question, you know, to not just have that, am I allowed to say this, middle-aged white sort of, you know, that sort of theatre.
We need to move beyond just doing our best between that, and all those companies you mentioned are all independent and working outside of the mainstream.
Yeah, and they're doing
you know, and I'm glad you said that, because that was actually the thing. I'd have to say the thing that bothered me possibly the most about the whole Australian Theatre Forum was that wasn't mentioned. It became a dichotomy a bit between black, white and Australia, and I was like, which is a really important issue, but also there are a lot of voices of people who were desperate to put up their hands who are working outside of those two extremes in the broad picture of a really diverse culture that we're in. And I think one of the biggest challenges we've got is how to then embrace as a theatre culture that diversity on our stages, on our mainstream stages. And I think, you know, the point is true. We're going to go, oh yeah, what the hell's that? We've got Greek, and we've got Italian, we've got an Afghani dad, but we're just going to have to do it. And our audiences are going to find it weird for a couple of years, but we just actually have to do it because we're 20 years behind the rest of the world. And for me, I think that is going to be the future of, that's the way theatre's going to survive. I mean, you mentioned, Sarah, I think about the question of, is theatre going to be here? You know, I think it's not if we don't actually embrace that change, because there's a whole lot of audiences that are going, well, I'm not on those stages, so I'm not going to go.
I think that's really true, and I think that all of the companies that Sonny mentioned, none of them have a subscriber base that they're performing to. And so the question's partly, you know, who's in the room, because it reflects the people who are subscribing to see the shows, and the major theatre companies are there. It's a.
And I also believe too.
Class subscribers and white middle class access to each other, and then
I think you also need to take a closer look at some of the cast lists. Bell Shakespeare, where I previously worked.
Yeah.
Aboriginal actors, Greek attack, and not made a big deal of. They just got cast in the roles, and they're there and they're performing. And
yeah, but the difference is instituting a policy, because that's why it's called a colorblind casting policy.
It's absolutely it.
Right. It's a policy that theaters have to consciously promote. You know, so when they audition notices, you know, I mean, as when this first came in the States, this is a colorblind, we have a colorblind casting policy. All people of all ethnicities are welcome to audition, you know, just cause, and et cetera. So it's a conscious thing that theaters have to, yeah.
And it is in Belgium.
Caitlin, just...
I don't know whether Claire's actually sort of articulated more clearly what I was thinking throughout the theatre forum, and particularly on the day I think we had the heavy hitters, the main stage theatres up on the podium, and then I think it was followed by the festivals, or maybe it was the day after. But there was a kind of sort of like an energetic block around these conversations getting critical or interesting, actually, especially when it was sort of the parameter was, I think Stephen Armstrong said, you know, in a write-up, you know, some people say that the main stages are here to stay, and we're here to sort of talk to them about the excellent level of programming, etc. And this was the opening ambit, and so I found it really refreshing when Sopa gave a postcard from the future, where in fact a main stage that we hold, you know, dear and central, was completely reimagined and really turned upside down. And I think the projection into the future around that was so liberating that you could even just propose that, in fact, for example, the STC no longer is the STC. It is the Multicultural House of Australia, which is cut off from the wharf and sent sailing into the harbour, and it has to exist on a completely new sort of ethical basis where sort of its cultural policy is explicit, you know, and at the moment it's implicit, it's embedded in subsidised tickets, but very expensive subsidised tickets. And I just think this tension was sitting at the heart of the theatre forum throughout, around public subsidy of tickets for companies that don't change fast enough. They need to change faster. Yeah.
One major thing, I know we've probably got to finish off soon, that came up at the ATF was community engagement as well too. You know, when touring plays or when you've just got a season, you know, the presenters, they need to commit to, you know, some kind of community engagement, and that's what, you know, I've had a whole tour just sort of fall apart because of that, basically, that they financially could not commit to a whole week of, you know, community engagement, which is what Black Lines is all about, you know, that I manage. It's not just bumping in, doing a performance and bumping out. It's about connecting. It's about getting the Aboriginal community and the non-Aboriginal community together to the theatres, coming together and watching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander work. And it seemed, it was like that word collaboration, and also it was community engagement came up a lot too. And you know, theatre is theatre, you can go watch a show, but I think it's great that also that you know, why not come along to not just you know, question and answers or welcome to countries or anything, you know, why not come along to some of their workshops that they do, you know, hear their stories, you know, how they made how they created, how they developed their shows and all that, And that's a really important thing about theatre as well too. Instead of just going to watch a show, pay $30, yeah, great show. I think it's so much more important to have that extra time to, learn a bit more about, the production itself, And that's what gets people that aren't in the theatre industry. That's how you get the audiences that aren't never been to theatre. If they go to a couple of workshops of, whatever, and they'll be just like, oh, shit, I want to go to see this show, So we've got to really sort of encourage that to, theatre companies as well too.
Yeah, I think that's really true, because I think the elephant in the room in some ways is that theatre's not that popular. It's...
No.
But see, that comes back to what
Can I just tell you one thing? Can I just tell you one thing? I had a presenter from Queensland called me yesterday, just like, shit, Sonny, I put Jack Charles on at the same time as State of Origin. And I said, well, you're going to get no blackfellas there at the State of Origin because we all love our football. So I'm trying to do my best to try to get as many black people to but we all love our State of Origin,
But the but then the interesting thing for me in response to that is then what is theatre?
Maybe theatre isn't.
There's more.
It does. Not everybody has to come. I know that's a terrible thing to say, but it's great to have as many bugs on the street. But
it's great.
But just on that note, Brian would.
Just following on from the related question, aside from the Oklahoma guys, were there any artist talks? Who are the artists making works in theatre spaces or in performance that piqued your interest?
For me, Brian, you probably know. But for me, I thought Oklahoma Theatre were phenomenal, and for me marked the future of what I would like to see happen in Australian theatre. For me, this it's in terms of thinking about future, or in terms of thinking about theatre in Australia, and also making it specific to New South Wales. I've moved here from Melbourne, back from Melbourne 2 years ago, and the reason why I choose to live in Sydney with its higher rent and less funding is because I think that this city is very provocative, and it challenges and it pushes boundaries, and theatre isn't necessarily the imaginary fourth wall and the good old-fashioned play anymore. And I felt that I would like to keep those conversations moving towards what else theatre is, and I think the Oklahoma OK Radio project really pushed those questions, and so that I found quite inspiring. It was also great to see other, independent artists like my darling Patricia there. Ron Batten was there. Team Mess were there. So there is a younger generation of artists that are producing their own work that are there, and I guess they're that kind of Generation Y. And post-89ers, I think, is that are coming up and really are like, give us a space. We'll give us a space, any space. It can be a black box, it can be a street corner, and we'll do whatever we like with it, and we'll call it what we like, with whoever we like. And I relish that kind of bolshiness, and that's what I like about Sydney performance and theatre. They're interchangeable words for me, and so I don't know. Did that answer your question? Not really. No.
Sarah, do you think that's a trait unique to post-89ers?
No, I mean, some of us who are into grunge are still carrying that baton. No, I don't actually. I think that as you get older, or which is also what, I think one of the things that Enoch was saying in terms of the majors, like, they're all independent artists at one stage, and now they're all working for major theatre companies. So suddenly there's a bureaucracy that falls into place, and how can bureaucracy or arts administration be as radical as the process of making art itself? And I believe it can be. That sounds ridiculous. But I do believe that, like, you know, I think that there is that space for it, and there are some incredible curators and directors and general managers out there that really do push boundaries and go, well, let's just put this on and see what happens. And if no one comes, that's fine. We're putting, you know, and I think there needs to be more of that, in the same way that there needs to be more this idea of diversity as opposed to either or all the time.
Yeah.
Anyone else?
Just on that topic, and going back to Sopa's point about David Pledge's session, the session by Miss Chu was the one that stood out in my mind, because she challenged us about the way we do business, that artists may kind of have an innovative practice, but the models that we use to make theatre are so boring and so conservative, and very few kind of artists kind of actually think about it. They kind of adopt models without really thinking, you know, why am I doing this? And so the result is that, however independent those artists who go into the mainstream, go into the bigger companies were to begin with, they find themselves moving in a certain direction because they never made a decision. They never said, okay, what is the structure by which I will realise my practice? And there's a big discussion to be had about that, which is rarely had because it seems like a boring issue, and yet it's an absolutely crucial issue.
I felt like the boring arts manager but that was for me an area which didn't even remotely get touched on, which was the business of the arts, and that's a long-standing opinion of mine, that we use really conservative models for our businesses, and that you know, maybe that's another opportunity for a conversation, but
and you're quite an advocate of radical art business, I think.
Don't tell too many people. I won't get a job.
No, you're not. On that note, I feel like... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to find out what sort of conversations transpired, if at all, as to how the companies or independent artists were to make incursions into the curriculum. I'm partly, as well as being an independent artist and an arts manager, I'm also a drama educator, and you know, just the intensity of theatre as participation is in practice. And I just came off from also, you know, helming a colourblind production of a musical, which just made me go, oh, everything we were aspiring to is already happening, you know, at school level, but they're going to leave school within a few years and realise, hang on, everything, all the desires that we've placed during the postcards that you talk about, they're waiting for that to happen, but they're not necessarily going to encounter that, and will definitely fall back on, you know, the accounting and the other jobs. So I just wanted to find out what conversations regards to connecting to the education sector may have transpired.
For me, there was none. There was talk about a presence of theatre academics, or wishing there to be, or perhaps in the future there'd be more of a presence of theatre academics at the forum. But maybe Caitlin, because you were on...
There was nothing concrete came up in what I was listening to, and I was burning to talk to Tony Grabowski, or kind of put that on the table with him in terms of how the Australia Council positions themselves in this, because in my limited conversations with the Australia Council, they don't want to have a bar of arts in education apart from in a very ring-fenced dialogue with the states around the Artists in Residence program. But I think there's a huge conversation to be had in that area, which would be really about opening up process, making your work relevant, and, you know, getting generations of young people to kind of engage with what, you know, engage with that. And it is happening at school. It is sort of happening between grassroots organisations and schools. In my experience at Shopfront, certainly that's the dialogue, but there's no formal recognition of that work.
I hope it is, because when I was year 7 or year 8 in Queensland, and my sports teacher was my drama teacher as well too. And you know, I was really thrilled with, you know, that's when I found my thing. You know, I wanted to be in the arts industry. yet he was pathetic. You know, he was ridiculous. So I just, you know, I really hope, you know, in the future, you know, that they're, you know, I know teachers, they have to do pretty much everything these days, basically, but, you know, there are arts, drama teachers that, you know, especially when it gets to year 11, 12, and there are students that are really interested in, you know, the arts, that, you know.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that there's heaps of interest. It's
Yeah.
just the formal mechanisms for the grassroots organisations to come to the table with their experience. There's the major performing arts have an education forum every couple of years or what have you. There are some market mechanisms. They're reasonably well controlled through particular lenses, and in fact the cultural policy just allocated 9 million to particular companies to really boost their social inclusion programs, their engagement programs, and that got dispersed primarily to second tier majors, but nothing flowed down to the community sector.
Yeah.
And just from my experience of doing that within smaller organisations and within the independent sector, that's really challenging, because navigating the bureaucracy of the education department is really tricky without expertise. And so even when you've got an organisation that has a desire to move into education, and I know at Performance Space we did, it was really difficult and limited because we could never quite get traction to navigate the bigger bureaucracy, which was the Department of Education. So it needs some support to a certain degree.
It's about curriculum and market, and it's about who wants to own that curriculum gateway to ticket sales, to be frank. Yeah.
Okay, well, on that note, perhaps we could move downstairs to the bar area
That
and
sounds good.
have a drink and keep talking.
Please join us in thanking Sarah and all our panelists.